The scholar of the law wants to know what all of us want to know. What must we do to inherit eternal life, life that will not end? And so, in response to his question, Jesus asked the scholar another question. What does the law of Moses say? And the scholar, who has studied the law all of his life, answers correctly. We should love both God and our neighbor. But the scholar, being used to complicated answers, is not satisfied with this simple response. And so, to show that he understands how complicated the question really is, he asked Jesus yet another question. Well, who is my neighbor? Is my neighbor my countrymen, those who live near me? What about foreigners and aliens? Are they my neighbors? And then, in response to the scholar's question, Jesus tells the story of a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan who encounter a man who is in dire straits. And then Jesus asks the scholar another question. Which of the three of these was a neighbor to the man who had been robbed? And the scholar answers correctly, the one who treated him with mercy. To which Jesus says, "Go and do likewise." Notice what happens in this story. Jesus turns the scholar's question on its head. The scholar wants to know, who is my neighbor, so that I can draw a clear and distinct boundaries that will help me to determine what my obligation is. And so if these people are my neighbors, I will help them. But if they are not my neighbors, I'm not obligated to help them. But instead of telling the scholar who his neighbor is, Jesus asks him, which of the three was a neighbor to the man in need? And so you see, the question is not, who is my neighbor, but how can I be a neighbor to those in need? And the answer to that question is mercy and compassion. By being merciful and compassionate to people in need, we become a neighbor to them. By treating other people with mercy and compassion, we become a neighbor. And so Jesus doesn't give us a neat and handy definition of neighbor that allows us to be kind to some people but not to other people. He doesn't define who the neighbor is. Rather, he challenges us to become a neighbor to anyone who is in need. He calls us to be merciful and compassionate, just as God is merciful and compassionate to us. The world looks very different in the light of the parable of the Good Samaritan. The parable is really describing a new world, God's new creation, where we become neighbors to each other rather than ask, "Who is my neighbor?" Imagine living in this new world where we don't define our neighbors in terms of those who are near us or like us or think the way we do. We don't define our neighbor in terms of race and nationality. In fact, we don't define our neighbor in any way whatsoever. But rather, in God's new world, which has already begun in the church, we now view our neighbor as anyone in need. And we seek to become a neighbor by being merciful and compassionate. Like the scholar of today's gospel, we are often asking the wrong question. The question is not, "Who is my neighbor?" The question is, how can I be a neighbor to those in need? And the answer to that question is very simple: by being merciful and compassionate.